ChopMan, Games Without Code. Created for developers of all levels and based on the beloved classic arcade game Pac-Man, this project was created to be an easy to follow step-by-step guide that would give you the tools, techniques, and experience of creating a full game from start to finish. All the game assets, textures, UI, and effects were created from scratch, and we're giving them to you for free. So if you wish to follow along step by step, you can download the ChopMan project files from the links in the description or from the Unity Asset Store.
In this Games Without Code video, we're going to create our main menu using Bolt. To begin, we're going to go to our ChopMan folder, and under Textures, if we go to our UI folder, we can see the different UI elements that we have to create our menu. So we'll begin by selecting our ChopMan title screen sprite sheet, and we can see that in our inspector that this sprite mode is set to single. So the first thing we want to do is under our sprite mode, we want to change that from single to multiple. And once we have that, we're going to click apply. So next thing that we're going to do is we're going to open up our sprite editor. So in our sprite editor, we're going to take our sprite sheet and create individual sprites from it. So to do that, we can left click and drag, and we can see that we now have a binding box around our sprite. So with our binding box around our sprite, if we want to remove all this empty area that we have between the end of our sprite and the background, if we click on the trim button, we can see that it now removes all the empty background space and selects only the pixels within our defined sprite bounding box. So we're going to hit apply, and if we go back out to our inspector, we can see that we now have that game over separated as its own sprite. What we want to do now is we want to separate all these elements into their own individual sprites. Now, along with being able to left click and drag and creating a sprite, we can also additionally go under our slice drop down and set this to automatic, and if we click slice, we can see that Unity has now separated each of these elements into individual sprites. However, some of the elements, such as our text element, instead of needing to be individual sprites, we all need these as one sprite. So we're going to hit revert to remove the slice that we just did, and essentially we're going to just draw a bounding box over each of these additional sprite elements. So instead of constantly having to go back into the top and essentially going to our trim, what we can do also is we can hold shift and press T, which is the hotkey for the trim within the sprite editor window. So once we have all our sprites cut out, if we click on our sprite, we can see that at the bottom of our screen, we have a sprite information box which tells us the name, the position, its height, and its width. So in order to keep the scenes better organized, we're going to go and we're going to rename our sprites. So once we have all our sprites renamed, we're going to hit apply, and I'm going to close out of our sprite editor, and we can now see if we expand our sprite, all of our sprites in our sprite sheet separated and renamed. Now for our menu, we're only going to be using a few of these. However, we put several extra sprites on here that can be used when creating your game. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to right click and we're going to go under UI and we're going to select image. And we can see once we do that, we now have a canvas and an image game object, as well as our canvas components and our UI and image components as well. And additionally, we have this event system. So the first thing that we're going to do before we begin is we're going to go under canvas. Instead of having this as a screen space overlay, we're going to set this to a screen space camera. So this is just a matter of personal preference. So essentially this just makes our canvas a lot smaller and more manageable. So if we set it on overlay, we can see that our UI and our canvas and our UI is much larger. So this just allows us to work with a lot more manageable size within our scene. So next thing, we're going to go to our plane distance, and instead of 100, we're going to set our plane distance to 20. So we're going to select our camera and we're going to change that from perspective to orthographic. And we're going to decrease our size from 5 and we're going to decrease that down to 2. Additionally, we're going to go with our far, and instead of 100, we're going to make that 25. And we're also going to set our canvas scale, and we're going to set that to scale with screen size. And for our resolution, we're going to go 1920 by 1080. If we look within our scene, we can see that we have a much smaller canvas, a much more manageable work area. So the first thing we want to do is we want to adjust our anchor points. And we want to have the anchor points for our image stretching out to the width and height of our canvas. So to do that, we're going to click our anchor preset box, and by holding Shift and Alt, if we click the bottom right, we can now see that it not only adjusts our anchor points, but it also adjusts the image within it as well. So first thing that we're going to do is we're going to load in our background image. We're going to move that into our image sprite, and we're going to turn off ray tracing for this. And let's rename this to background image. Next, we're going to duplicate our background image, and we're going to get our arcade cabinet frame. So we're going to select that sprite and we're going to drag that into our images component, and let's rename this to arcade frame. Next, we're going to duplicate that once again, and we're going to grab our vignette and we're going to move that. Let's then select our arcade frame game object and let's duplicate that once more. I'm going to move that right before the frame vignette, and we're going to place our ChopMan logo. So by holding Shift, we can select our anchor points and our image will scale with our anchor points. Additionally, if we go into our inspector with our logo game object selected and click on preserve aspect ratio, we can see that it now keeps the aspect ratio despite the size of our rect transform and our anchor points. So this way it'll allow us to know that our image or our logos aren't being stretched and it has the correct proportions based on the aspect ratio. So let's rename this game object. And let's duplicate our logo. And for this, we're going to move this down by holding Shift and Control, grabbing our anchor points. We can move our object as well as our anchor points and keep that positioning together. So within our sprite sheet, we're going to go and we're going to select our play button. And we're going to replace that ChopMan logo with our play button. And we just want to make sure that our play button is fairly big and prominent within our menu. So for our play button, we want to go inside our inspector. We want to make sure that ray trace target is on. And we also want to add a button component. And for the last piece of our menu, what we're going to do is we're going to take our background image, we're going to duplicate this, we're going to move it up to right under our background image, and we're going to remove our image from here, and we're just going to call this black screen. So now that we have all of the elements for our menu UI, let's begin creating the functionality for our menu UI as well. Now that our menu UI setup is complete, let's begin adding our functionality. So before we begin, we're going to first go to the asset store and we're going to get dotween. So for those of you that haven't used dotween before or heard of dotween, dotween is an extremely fast and efficient way of creating animation within and between your components within Unity, within C# or a visual scripting engine. Additionally, dotween is also free, although there is a paid version. However, the free version is extremely robust and should have all the functionality you need to create almost any type of game. And once we have it downloaded, we're going to click our import button. And then we're going to import dotween into our scene. So once we have dotween successfully imported, we're met with this setup window. So we're just going to click Open Dotween Utility Panel. And from there, we're going to hit our Setup Dotween. And once Unity is finished compiling, we're going to hit Apply. And then we're going to close our dotween utility panel. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to connect dotween to Bolt. So to do that, we're going to close our asset store, and if we go under Tools and under Bolt and click Unit Options Wizard, and from here we want to go to the bottom of our Unit Option Wizard and we're going to click this plus button. And within our assembly search bar, we're going to go down and we're going to click dotween. So once that's complete, we're going to click our next button. So within the type options panel of the utility wizard, we're going to scroll to the bottom and we need to add dotween's units that we're going to be using within Bolt. So we're going to click our plus button, and the first thing that we're going to add is the tween. Next, we're going to add dotween. And lastly, we're going to add our shortcut extensions. And once we have these three added, we're going to hit generate. And then we're going to let Bolt incorporate dotween within our code base. Now that dotween is loaded into Bolt, we can begin creating our functionality. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to right click and we're going to make an empty game object. And we're going to call this object main menu macro manager. And once we have that created, we're going to click add component and we're going to add a state machine. So now let's click our new macro. And we're going to create a macro and save that into our macro folder. And we're going to call that main menu macro. And let's rename our state machine to main menu state machine macro. With our state machine component created and our macro saved, let's go into our state graph. So the functionality that we're trying to create, we want the player to be met with the black screen within our arcade cabinet. And from there, we want that black screen to slowly fade out and reveal our background. And at that point, we want our logo to pop onto the screen. And then we want our play button to pop on the screen as well. And while that play button is on the screen, we want that to get larger and smaller to indicate that that button needs to be pressed. So to begin, we're going to create 3 game object variables for our game objects that we want to capture. So the first one, we're going to call that logo object. Second, we're going to call play button object. And the third one, we're going to call black screen object. And we're going to change these to game object variables. And since these are scene object variables, we're just going to drag the objects from our scene into our variables for our value. Next, we're going to create 2 vector3 variables. And we're going to call this logo original scale vector3 and player button original scale v3. And we're going to change these to a vector3 type. Lastly, we're going to create 1 float variable for our black screen alpha, which we're going to be using the alpha to fade that out. And we're going to change that into a float. And we want to put a value of 1 because we want that to be fully visible when our game starts. So with the variables created, let's go into our start state. So for our start state, we're not going to be using our update or our exit. So we can grab these and we can delete these to begin. So in our start state, what we want to do is we want to capture and set the values that we're going to be using at the beginning of the scene. So first we want to capture and we want to set our logo object. So let's go into our object variable window and we're going to grab our logo object. And on this, we also, for our logo object, what we want to do is we want to get our transform component, our scale transform component. So we're going to type get component and we're going to set that component to a transform. Next, we want to get the local scale from our component. So once we get our local scale, we want to store that local scale inside of our logo original scale vector 3 variable. So we're going to type set logo original scale vector 3 and let's connect this. So now that we have our object's current scale, what we want to do is we want to set a new scale and we want to start that off at 0. Because essentially we don't want that to be seen by the player when the menu starts. We want that to pop into view. So we're going to say set local scale. And we can keep that on 0. And what we want to set instead of self, we want to drag in our logo object variable. So we want to set the logo object variable to 1. And it's going to connect our start into our component. So additionally, we want to do this for our play button as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to select, so once we get those selected, we're going to hit Control D to duplicate that. I'm just going to drag this down a little bit farther down so we can have a nice space to work. So at this point, we can just simply change our variable. So we're going to change that logo object into our play button object. And we want to change the value that we gather into our play button vector 3, and we also want to set our play button object as well, and we want to set that at 0. So lastly, we need to set our black screen. So we're going to grab our 2 couple nodes here just to kind of start us off. We're going to copy these and we're going to paste these and move that just in its own area. And let's change the variable into our black screen object. And the component that we wanted to get is the image. So once we get our image component, we next need to use the black screen alpha to set the color of the image. So let's drag in our black screen alpha variable, and here we're going to use a create color with RGBA, and let's drag, we need to put this into our alpha. And next we need to set the image color. So we're going to get a set image color node. And the image that we want to use is the component from our black screen object. So we're going to drag this into our set image color node. And the color that we want to use is the color that we just created using our black screen alpha. So we're going to drag that into the set screen node. And for the sake of organization, let's group these together. We can do that by holding Control and left clicking and dragging, and we can see now we have a image box. And with this, it allows us to move all our nodes within that image box. Let's get the rest of these in that image box. And we can now move all of the nodes that we have within that image box simultaneously, as well as create a name to keep our nodes better organized. And let's do this for our other node groups as well. And this will just help us to better organize our scene. So now that we have that created and set, let's test that out before we can continue creating our next state. So we can now see that our black screen color is set to black, our logo object scale is set to 0, and our play button object scale is set to 0 as well. And if we go into our variables, we can see that it's captured the scale of our logo object as well as our play button. And one of the reasons that we want to capture the scale of our objects instead of just simply placing them at a value of 1 is because if we change the scale of the objects in our scene, we don't want to have to go and continuously adjust our vector 3 scale variables. So this way, no matter the scale that we adjust the objects in our scene, we know that it will be captured and set within our state machine. So let's go back into the main graph for our state. We're going to right click and we're going to create another flow state, and we're going to name this flow state arcade screen fader. Let's right click and create our transition to our arcade fader state. And within our transition, we're simply going to have a start. So let's go inside of our arcade fader state. And for arcade fader state, we're simply going to be using the update event, so we can remove our start and our exit event. Now within the state, what we wanted to do is we wanted to slowly fade from black to reveal our background over a set amount of time. So we're going to use the same logic that we use for our blink as well as our ghost blend shapes. So we're going to start with our get delta time. Let's create a new float, and we're going to call this fade speed. And we'll start off by setting the fade speed at about 5, and then we're going to drag our fade speed variable into our graph. Now instead of multiplying like we did with the blend shapes, we're going to divide, since our black screen alpha is just a value of 1. So we're just going to divide that in order to be able to control the speed of our fade. So we're going to add a divide node. And we want that to subtract into our black screen alpha. And then we want that new value to be set as the new black screen alpha value. Next, we wanted to create a new color with our new value, and we're going to plug that value into our alpha. So once we have our color created, we wanted to set the image component in our black screen object with the new color. And we're going to plug our color into our image color. So let's hit play to test that out. And we can now see our black image, the alpha slowly fading out, revealing our background image. Be sure to join us for part 2, where we'll finish creating our main menu. And don't forget to hit the notification bell and subscribe.